One of the prevailing things from VAMP that we've talked about, and I'm not going to soapbox on it again, is that issuers are being held accountable, right? For right reason codes, for citing the right way, for those types of things. And so I think if you know the scheme regulations and you know how to navigate that stuff, right, having that evidence is, yes, absolutely positive or positively powerful, because that is compelling evidence. But I think we're still not to a place where having it means 100% win rate.
Welcome to ChargeFoward with Chargebacks 911. My name is Jarrod. I'm the head of marketing and revenue operations for Chargebacks 911. And I have a guest with me today that I'm real excited to talk to. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the technology side for chargebacks and the industry and payments. Zach Matthews, thank you so much for joining us today. Zach is the head of technology. What is your official title? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do for Chargebacks 911?
Yeah, so I wear a lot of hats, but my title is VP of Solutions Engineering and Technical Partnerships. And basically what I'm responsible for is working primarily with our biggest customers, but really managing the integration experience of, right, like when someone wants to do business with us, making sure that we can go in and get all of the data that we need to be able to deliver on that experience. And then the other arm with that is developing technical partnerships to make that easier for our customers. So, right, managing our relationships with FIs like WorldPay, from a technical perspective to make sure that our integrations with them create the best customer experience.
That's great. And so you're perfectly positioned to answer a lot of the questions of the day. Today's webinar, we're going to talk about a study that we're going to be releasing out. Probably by the time this releases, the study's already going to be out. It's called the Cardholder Dispute Index. And for this study, what we do is we talk to more than 1,000 cardholders. And we ask them all kinds of questions to try to understand, what their buying preferences are, what some of the drivers are, what their feelings and understanding of the chargeback process are. And, I think there's some important insights. So actually in today's podcast, the first half, Zach and I are just going to have a conversation here, and then we're actually going to go record a webinar. And then we're going to come back here and then answer some additional questions, some secret questions that we didn't have time for during the webinar. So it's going to be a great conversation. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to try to make it as helpful as possible. But before I dive into all of that, Zach, I have a really hard-hitting question that this podcast is known for, and that is. Do you collect knickknacks? Is that what is going on with the shelf behind you?
So my home office, I spend a lot of time in it.
Yeah.
And so I've decorated it. That shelf is a collection of things that represent a lot of my travels. So like over here, you can see that's a statue from Rome. That's Christ the Redeemer, right? So like it represents places that I've traveled. And then there's other stuff back there that's just important to me. So it's one of those that like when I'm working, I can turn around and stare off into the wall and think about all the cool places that life and my job has taken me.
Yeah, that's great. To be honest with you, I'm learning more about you through those shelves than like all the conversations that we've had. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's get back to the task at hand. I think something that would be helpful, because in this webinar, we discuss it a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about these, some of the tools that are available to prevent chargebacks and to use those, not only to prevent chargebacks, which is their straight ahead use, but to sort of counterbalance the force of the pressures that are incentivizing cardholder behavior. So just so that when we talk about that, people have a good understanding. Can you walk me through, like, what are the categories of these products? Which ones are more important, less important? What's available for merchants from a prevention standpoint?
Yeah. So, right. Well, I think actually prevention is one piece of it. And then there's, right, like, what do you do after you have a chargeback? And I think those are the two different pieces. So, from a prevention perspective, you've got your traditional alerts, right? So, those are in partnership with Ethica and Verify. We do also have proprietary alerts, but the basic idea is an alert is a notification of an incoming chargeback that allows you to provide a refund to prevent it. The traditional stuff, right? Like the names that people would recognize, right? So there's Ethica alerts, there's CDRN through Verify, RDR through Verify, right? And so all of those alert products, we are integrated to sell through one integration. So right, a merchant can through a partnership with us get access to alerting coverage from multiple organizations, right? Ethica and Verify, as well as our proprietary stuff. And then in the webinar, right, you're going to hear me talk about because I'm talking about it a lot. Compelling evidence and order insight; those have become very top of mind to the market now because of what Visa's done with VAMP and some of the changes. And so I like to call those real-time data alerts. So right, like the other alerts, when someone files a chargeback, it pauses the chargeback and sends the information, and the only thing you can do is refund it. It's basically an opportunity to give the cardholder their money back to avoid receiving a chargeback. Real-time data alerts work totally different. They're a newer product, and it's taken a bit of work from the networks to get issuers to integrate for them because it's a stickier, heavier integration, and right, it's newer technology. But what real-time data alerts allow is an opportunity for a merchant to provide input in real time to a claim that's being made with a bank. So to break that down, if I call my bank and my bank is integrated for this service. When I say, hey, I don't really recognize this transaction on this date, they can click a button, and that button can pull back additional information from the merchant. And that can be things like what I actually bought, a description of the service, information on the last time I accessed the service, a bunch of stuff that then allows the issuer to have a talk down conversation and be like, well, hey, here's some extra information. Do you recognize it now? And right, like, if it proceeds in a certain direction, that'll be where compelling evidence comes into play, which is compelling evidence is a specific add-on when right, or it's an upgraded service when the cardholder says, I don't recognize that transaction and I'd like to file a fraud chargeback, basically. And so for 10.4, which is Visa's claims of not card not present fraud, when that's triggered, it calls out for information that allows you as a merchant to disprove the claim of fraud. And the result of that is if you are able to provide the transactional information that proves that actually Zach has done business with us before, so it can't be fraud, then what happens is I still get my money back because the expectation with my bank was that I filed a chargeback, but the chargeback isn't filed. The issuer, my bank, right, as the cardholder would pay me my money back, and you as a merchant never receive a chargeback. You don't get a TC15, you don't get a TC40, and so it doesn't cost you. And for this service, you don't have to refund it, right? Because you've actually proved that it's an invalid claim. And so that refund is coming from the issuer. And so it's a way of holding the issuer accountable for whether or not the claims that they're putting into the system are true or not. And so the real-time data alerts are really exciting right now because I do believe that this is going to be an area of investment for Visa, right? Once the highway is built, we can push a lot more stuff through it. And I think they've focused on fraud because that's something that's particularly vexing for merchants, right? If a cardholder claims fraud, they just get their money back. So I think Visa addressed that first. But if you think about things that can be resolved in real time with data, there's other stuff. And the cool thing is, a human's not looking at it and saying, oh yeah, I agree with this. What happens is if the issuer pushes the button, the data gets sent to Verify. And Verify is looking at it and it's code that's verifying it. If it finds those transactions, the decision's made on behalf of the merchant. The deflection rate for this product is over 97% for all of the customers that we have. And that 3% represents situations when the merchant provides information that can't be validated. And right, I'm going to assume that it's innocent, right? But then another way of putting it is we've been given bad data, so the service doesn't work. And so, right, but the point is this is what I like to call a one shot, one kill type thing, right? Like if you have this service and you have the data, it prevents this situation. And so, right, like it's a way of helping separate claims of fraud, from real fraud. And I think the thing about it is historically it wasn't heavily integrated, and it's a harder integration. But what's cool about integrating with us is it's again one integration for all the services that exist today and in the future. And so as an example, Ethica MasterCard has a similar service that we are also integrated to be able to provide through the same integration with you as a merchant. And so a merchant can have a conversation with us and access services that would typically require multiple integrations, not two, more than two. And so one relationship provides all of the the pre-chargeback, the deflection services.
Yeah.
And then,
Or the
right,
most appropriate, right? I
correct.
think that's in addition to the one stop. I think having a company that you can work with, that you can trust, help you identify the solutions that are going to be the right fit for what your business goals are is one of the challenges, right?
Oh,
These aren't like
100%.
off the shelf type of one size fits all. There's a lot of instances where one deflection or resolution product will make a lot of sense, but another one won't. And having somebody walk you through that and handle the complicated parts of the integration and setup, I think is pretty much invaluable. Because if you work with a company that's for example, if you go direct to a company that provides some of these services, they're going to have the services that they're going to have, and that's what they're going to sell you. But when you work with a company like ours that solves this problem as well as a host of other problems that you're going to encounter the surrounding chargebacks, you've got a company that's able to create a a custom solution that's going to solve your problem in the best way. That it's not going to be, you're not going to be sold anything because it's the thing that is available, which is I think a
And
danger that a
the
lot
other
of
side
people.
to that too, though, is where we're positioned in that process also provides, right, one of the services that we can provide is a comprehensive view
Yeah,
of your chargebacks, right? If you
that's right.
work with Visa Verify directly, you're going to get a view of your chargeback management on that card scheme. And if you work with that, right, and literally we have merchants that come to us, right, from direct relationships because there's value in having one consistent, comprehensive strategy for managing your chargebacks. And right, that's the other piece of it, is that was only just the deflection. What happens if a chargeback gets through? Because here's the other thing. You might not want to prevent every chargeback, because think about this. What if when the chargeback comes in, that you can tell by the claim, right? You have the evidence that, right, you can win the chargeback. And what if it's a $500 chargeback? I don't want to give $500 back, right? I have to refund. I just told you the alerts stop the chargeback by giving a refund.
Yeah.
And so representments, right, defending the chargeback if you let it through, is also a strategy that can be very important for high ticket items, enterprise businesses, because there's really two things, right? You want to prevent the chargeback to keep your levels at an appropriate level, right? Because again, we talked about, or we will talk about the idea that Visa through VAMP monitors those levels and regulates them. And so, right, like keeping your levels correct and healthy is an important part of maintaining your business. But alerts are relatively more expensive than representments because you have to give a refund. It's not just the cost of the alert, right? So with a representment, if I can defend the chargeback and win it, I get to keep the value of the transaction instead of having to give it back. And
Yeah.
so it's those situations where, right, a combination of those two things together. And here's the thing. A lot of these other resellers only offer their alerts, which means they're only interested in their revenue. And
Yeah.
so working with a partner that can step back and look at your goals and your objectives, which is the cheapest route to handling a chargeback, right? We're in a unique position to provide that because we utilize several different services, but across the entire spectrum, not just the
Okay.
deflection world.
So if you haven't noticed, this episode is brought to you by Chargebacks 911 today. So I don't want to seem like this is a big commercial. So real important question: how are things in Vegas?
Vegas has been a little weird. It's been good, but I mean, we definitely, tourism is down. There's no question. I think, for me, the 4th of July is always a really big kind of fun thing living in Vegas because you get access to one of the best fireworks shows in the world.
Yeah.
And what I would say is a lot of the casinos didn't even do a fireworks show this year.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like the
So you're
strip
saying
did
it's
not.
down over year, not just down because it's 500 degrees or whatever it is.
Correct. Like
Right.
tourism
Hmm.
is scant. I mean, like, and where I normally watch the fireworks is a friend that has a condo on the strip that's quite nice, but like you could see the entire strip was just empty. There was no
Huh.
traffic. There was no, and so like it's a little weird. I mean, like Vegas is good. There's some cool stuff going on. I'm excited for convention season because I think that
Yeah.
that always helps kickstart. Now is the slow time. There's no question, right? But I mean, it's definitely slow, and I think the 4th of July celebration was definitely a pointer for that because the strip wasn't lit up and all the locals casinos, the rest of the valley was, because all the locals never go to the strip. That's not right. Like, unless they can watch it from afar, that's not what they're doing. And so, right, like we still celebrated, but it was definitely endemic of the fact that visitation and tourism is down for us. So,
Well, good. As long as you still celebrate it, that's the thing that keeps me up at
absolutely.
night, man. All right. So, all right. Well, so now we're going to cut. We're going to have a pretty extended excerpt from the webinar on this topic, the Cardholder Dispute Index. It's going to get a little wonky. It's going to, you're not going to be able to see our gorgeous faces. It's going to be real stat heavy. But stick through it. It's got some interesting information, and then Zach and I will join you on the other side, and we're going to answer some questions that were submitted by the attendees of the webinar, and then also that were submitted when they registered for the webinar. So we've got a bunch of questions. So if you attended the webinar or if you're just joining us for the first time, you're going to be pretty much all caught up, and we're going to go through the questions one by one. So thank you very much. Okay, now this chart has some elements to it, and it actually includes data from both the studies that I just mentioned, which were the field report, which, as a reminder, is a survey of merchants, and the Cardholder Dispute Index, which is this study. So the red indicates the answers that we are reporting in the Cardholder Dispute Index, that is cardholder preference. So we asked cardholders, what is your preferred method of payment? Now, the vast majority said credit or debit cards, but for those that didn't, we sort of broke it out. And then we overlay onto that, and we see something very interesting because we overlay onto it the answers that merchant gave us as to what other ways do you allow your customers to pay. And I think it's very interesting because it's clear from this chart that merchants are listening to their customers, and there is a very, very strong correlation between cardholder preference and customer preference and the options that merchants are making available. I am still surprised, given that in our study across the board, there was more than 12% of cardholders that preferred to use wallet checkout. I think that number is going to steadily increase. So it is surprising to me that only 52% of merchants say that that's an option that they currently are making available to their customers. Zach, is there anything else that stands out in this chart for you?
I mean, the two things that I think are pretty funny is gift cards are on there, right? But it's pretty low. Like cardholders don't. That's the biggest gap in terms of like offered but not used, other than the P2P payment methods. But the P2P payment method and mobile wallet, most of those still, right? Like, because PayPal would be in the P2P, they still ride on top of a credit card. So, right, like we call them alternative payment methods, but ultimately what we're looking at is a mixture of like a different way of using a credit card, and then things that are truly different. And if you look at it, the stuff that results back to a credit card is still the stuff that is the most widely available and the most widely trusted.
Yeah, very, very good points. And your point about the alternative payment method, we actually debated a lot. We went through a couple of iterations with this study because we tried to avoid using the term alternative payments because it gives the idea that all of these payment options are something other than a credit or debit card. But to your point, pretty much all of them or many of them tie back to a credit or debit card. So they're built on the credit or debit card rails. So alternative payment can be a misleading term. We also broke out the same answers by age, and pretty much across the board, the under 44 constituency is embracing these, I guess we can't say alternative payment methods, but different payment methods than the straight enter my credit card into the form method that historically has been how people shop online. So much so that mobile wallets, which seem to be very popular with the younger crowd, there's a 7 or 8 point disparity, almost double the younger people versus the older people. And that's probably because the mobile wallets rely on technology, and the over 44 crowd, I would imagine, is probably not as strong in that area. Is there anything else in here that stands out to you?
Yeah, there definitely is. So the two call outs again, I'm picking on gift cards. I love that under 44, no one wants it, right? So like that is wildly skewed that way. And in fact, other than buy now, pay later, which is still pretty close, it's the only thing where the 44 plus prefers more, right, than the under 44. So right, there's kind of like a innovation concept there. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the technology piece. And the other item is cryptocurrency. We hear it all the time. It's a buzzword, but right, like this kind of shows it's not fiat, it's not really currency. It's more at this point still an investment vehicle, right? Like more like a stock than like a credit card. And I think that it's interesting because again, we hear so much about it, but like less than a half of a percentage point was interested in it.
Yeah, that's true. The point about cryptocurrency is, I think the two interesting things here are that none of the respondents, I mean, we surveyed more than 1,100, almost 2,000, but a lot of them we did not include in the study for a variety of reasons. But of the ones that appeared to be legitimate responses, none of the people that were over 44 said that they like to use cryptocurrency. Now, it isn't many in the under 44, but it is telling that nobody over 44 did that. And I wonder, even that 0.41%, I wonder how much of that is genuine and how much of it is almost a protest vote. They like the idea of cryptocurrency. I wonder how many of them are prepared to pay with cryptocurrency if given the opportunity.
I mean, there's not really an offering for it. And what's interesting is, I mean, there's several credit cards now where you can connect them to your cryptocurrency wallet and they perform the conversion, transact on ACH rails and pay in right, like recognized state currency. And then you can earn your rewards in the underlying cryptocurrency. And so, right, like that's starting to mobilize cryptocurrency as currency, but still not really, right? Because they have to convert it to something else. And they're doing that via what? Well, credit card rails, which is something where that would actually make that. I mean, arguably, are you paying with credit card or are you paying with crypto at that point?
Yeah, right. That's a very good point. I mean, you could pay with anything with cryptocurrency if what you're doing is changing it into cryptocurrency. I know a lot of times when people pay with cryptocurrency, they're doing that, right? If for some reason you want to participate in if you need cryptocurrency to make a purchase for anything, typically what you're going to do is you're going to buy that cryptocurrency. A lot of people will just buy it, so they'll convert fiat into cryptocurrency pretty much in real time, and vice versa. If they get paid in cryptocurrency, I think most merchants are going to convert that into fiat pretty immediately.
Yeah, I mean, unless they have a strategy for again it being an investment vehicle, because if you compare that to any other type of fiat currency, Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency is wildly more volatile, which makes it a better like a better day trade prospect than a right currency, which is supposed to be reliable. We talk about economies not being in good shape when the currency isn't reliable.
Okay. And then we're just drilling down into the mobile wallets to really show, because, it gave a sense of it, the disparity. But if you break it to the 60 and over and under 30, the disparity is even more. It's 2.5 times, the preference. And I just think it's interesting, like when you break out, in these 4 buckets, that the trend is so consistent. The older you are, the less appealing the idea of paying with a mobile wallet is. So this is one of those things where, all things being equal, if the technology didn't even change, just the shifting demographic is going to drive more and more cardholders and consumers into using this technology. All right, so this next chart's preferred means of resolving issues. Now, this does not mean that they resolve issues through their bank 76% of the time, but all things being equal, do they have a better experience resolving issues through the bank or through the seller? There was also a age correlation here that I think is very interesting, because the over 45 crowd is much less likely to prefer to resolve issues through the bank. And I think, Zach, you and I talked about, there was a couple of different reasons why the older generation might not be as chargeback prone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to technology. So to file a chargeback, I don't have to talk to someone all the time. I can go to my banking app if you're with many of the big banks and do it right through a mobile application experience. In my experience, right, there's a correlation with age and wanting to get on the telephone, right? People under 30 will, pretend like they're not home if you ring the doorbells is the
Mhm.
joke. And so I think being able to do that from a convenience perspective, the banks make it easy because they're not there to create friction the same way that maybe you are in your refund process, because you don't want it to be too easy to get a refund. And I think the other piece with that, and right, we're going to see this in some coming slides, banks have a lot more technology to be able to provide an instant resolution. When you call your bank and you file a chargeback, they put a credit on your credit card because it's their credit card. The merchant can't do that. They have to push a refund through the rails, and that can take 5 to 7 business days to get there. And younger people are impatient because they've never lived in a world where they had to wait 3 to 5 business days for their paycheck. They get it the same day because they've only ever worked under those conditions. Those of us that know what it's like to have to wait 5 to 7 business days for your paycheck are able to understand that that's just the reality of it for a refund. And so I think there is a direct age correlation because payments has changed so much over even the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the big picture takeaway that you can get from this is that, just like with the alternative payment methods, there's going to be a demographic shift if everything remains exactly the same, right? As more and more young people, get credit cards and become your customers, the sentiment around this idea is going to continue to swing in the direction of, processing disputes with your bank. So that's something that is important to keep in mind, that even if we're successful at, changing the attitude or stopping the sort of overall trend towards, disputes, the younger people are going to continue to be more likely to do it.
So that's a really great point. I think one of the ways that merchants can really change that relationship with providing an experience that the bank can't is having a loyalty program and tying it into your chargeback process. So, right, creating an incentive for your customers to contact you and resolve it with you, because if they file a chargeback, they don't have their loyalty points adjusted or there's some sort of penalty, is a great way of encouraging them to reach out and resolve stuff with you as a vendor if they care about that relationship and want to preserve it. And so, right, like that's a way of making your best customers pay more attention to you because the bank can't do that. And so that's something that you as a merchant can provide and retain as a unique differentiator from the bank.
That's true. But the basic point is that your bank is optimized to provide a quality customer experience for their customers, which is the cardholder. And so we asked those that had filed a dispute within the last 12 months, that dispute process, how satisfied were they? Almost 90%. So by far, a majority said that they were satisfied or very satisfied with the dispute experience. So banks are really doing everything that they can to remove friction, to make it easy, to make it a satisfying experience for their customers when they have an issue. And then we took the just very satisfied responses, and then we broke that out by the cards that people owned, or the banks that people owned or used. And it's a pretty tight cluster, and this list isn't really meant to call anybody out, because all of these, if you bundle satisfied and very satisfied, were well above, 60, 70, 80%. So nobody had a low score. Everybody was doing really well. But you can see here that some are doing a little bit better than others. And so this is a competitive advantage that different, issuing banks have, is how well they manage the expectations and make their customers satisfied. And this is a very real pressure that is causing them to reduce friction. And Zach also talked about the pressure, the regulatory pressure, right, that they have. But this competitive pressure is very real. Nobody's going to unilaterally disarm and say, I am going to give my customers a hard time and make sure that they have a legitimate reason for filing a dispute. All they have to do is select a different credit card, and they can have that frictionless experience that they want. Okay, so let's see. Customers who dispute a transaction without contacting the merchant, and then customers who view disputes as a refund alternative. So both of these points, the refund alternative, we just asked, straight ahead, do you view chargebacks essentially the same as a refund? Do you think that they're a valid alternative? And 3/4 of respondents said that, yeah, that it was a valid alternative. Now, this doesn't mean, because again, we look at, chargeback numbers, and 74% of transactions don't turn into chargebacks, and 74, there's still a lot of refunds that happen. There's still a lot of responsible cardholders. But from the experience of the cardholder, they're not making the differentiation that as merchants we would hope that they make, right? They're looking at what is the easier experience, what is the better experience, and they view them fairly the same. They're not aware that there's additional fees. I don't know that it would change their behavior if they were, but they're not aware that there's going to be penalties or fees or anything incurred by the merchant. So customers who dispute a transaction without contacting the merchant by age group. So these are, we asked, have you ever disputed a transaction without contacting the merchant first? And again, we see the behavior for older cardholders is only a third, right? But under 30 cardholders, it's more than half admit to filing dispute without first contacting the merchant.
And that goes back to the methods for contacting each, though, right? Like I would bet that Amazon, as an example, has less of that problem with that age group, because you can request a refund and do that right inside of an application. Most merchants don't have that experience. You have to call, you have to do those other things, and you either have to call or you have to email. Both of those don't sit well with the under 30 group, because they don't want to get on the phone and they don't want to wait, right? They want fast, immediate response without having to get on a telephone. And so if you can do it via text, app, etc., I think that that's a really big edge. And so I love this view because, right, the opposite is also true. Amazon continues, right, and retailers continue to make it harder to get to that refund option. So, right, like age 60 plus would rather call their, right, like they'll still try to reach out in many cases, but like it kind of starts to work the opposite. So, I mean, it suits what I think, again, the technology curve, and it makes sense.
This is and we drilled in on this during our conversation, but this was a number that surprised me, because most of these questions were such that I felt like cardholders would probably give me a straight answer. I did not expect them to give me a straight answer with the question if you ask them if they've admitted to exaggerating or straight lying when filing a dispute. And a third of the respondents admitted to that. Now, I don't know, maybe that means that 2/3 of the respondents have actually done it, or maybe we just, people tend to be a little bit more honest than you would expect when they have a, when it's an anonymous survey. But I was surprised that it was this high. We asked the question, we didn't think we'd get an answer that would be surprising, and we definitely did. And then the other question is almost an obvious one, but we asked the cardholders, after you successfully dispute a charge, are you more likely or less likely to dispute a charge the next time that there's an issue? And overwhelmingly, they said more likely. In fact, more said it this year than they did when we asked the same question last year. And this is, I think, an honest thing, because if you change this out with any other service, you say, if you have a great meal and a great time eating at a restaurant, are you more or less likely to eat at that restaurant again? I think everybody's pretty obvious. Well, I'm definitely more likely to eat at the restaurant where I love the food and I love the experience. And that's the same thing kind of applies to the dispute experience. But Zach, that 32.2, are you surprised by that, or is that pretty consistent with what you expect?
No, I mean, it's pretty consistent with what I'd expect. And I also agree with you that it's probably understated to some degree, just because, right, when somebody knows their behavior is naughty, even when it's anonymous, they don't really want to admit it. But I think it goes back to the behaviors that are being created and encouraged by the system. And I think I would take this the other direction. So like we said, the banks have an advantage. It's easier for them to provide a better experience. But if we know that somebody's going to go back to where they get the easiest resolution, the other piece of that, the other way of saying that is you guys should be really focused on, if somebody does reach out, providing a really easy experience that gets them what they want. Because another way of saying that is if you fight giving them a refund, they're going to call their bank. And once they call their bank, they're probably just going to keep calling their bank. Right. And I think I will also admit some guilt to that, right? Like I have merchants that I do, just places that I go to regularly, that if I have a problem, and I've had problems in the past, I know it's really easy to resolve. So I'll hop on the phone and I'll take care of it that way. And then there's other ones where I've tried to call them before and it's been a nightmare. I didn't get my money back and I wound up having to call my bank. And I'll be honest, I'm a lot more likely to just do that again afterwards, right? So in some ways, the whole "did you contact the merchant" it kind of turns into, have you ever tried to resolve a dispute with the merchant before? And right, like if the answer is yes and it didn't work out, they kind of just start going to their bank. And so I think as merchants, I would advise you guys to kind of consider that, because once the behavior is pushed that way, it's hard to get it back.
What are some of the countervailing forces that may help keep this trend in check?
Yeah, so I think I would point to, and I'm going to mostly talk about Visa because, right, like what inevitably happens in these situations is one of the schemes kind of leads the way. And I think Visa is the one making changes this time. On other topics, it's been MasterCard or the others. Visa released some changes to their fraud monitoring program and changed, the program to what's called VAMP, VAMP. And that stands for the Visa Acquirers Monitoring Program, right? Like they're now calling it like they're focused on monitoring the acquirer. And they've changed some of the thresholds and right, like regulations, and it does affect merchants. But a lot of what they're doing is very focused at making the acquirers a bit more involved in managing that aspect of it. And then alongside of that, there's also, right, things like compelling evidence, which is a product service that's offered by Verify for Visa, where when you have a chargeback that's being raised, if you're integrated for this service, you as a merchant are able to, in real time, via like a partner like Chargebacks 911, submit a rebuttal basically. So if you receive a 10.4 fraud allegation, Visa is providing a service called compelling evidence that you guys can provide other transactions from that cardholder that prove that they know you as a merchant, because under Visa's guidelines, a fraudulent transaction is one between a cardholder and a merchant that's unknown, right? It's an unknown entity. And so if you can prove that you've transacted with them before, that's not fraud. That's an unauthorized transaction, and the issuer didn't open that correctly. And so what that product does is the cardholder still gets their money back, but the issuer is the one that's liable for it. And as a merchant, you don't receive a TC40, you don't receive a TC15. And so it protects your ratio under the new guidelines, but it's also literally a way of holding the issuer accountable for the validity of the chargebacks that they open. And so I think, right, if I were to talk about like what's the counter to the doom and gloom, I do see it being very likely that Visa is going to continue to look for ways to hold issuers accountable, because once they're integrated for order insights and compelling evidence, I can think of some other specific allegations that you as merchants could disprove using data. Things like duplicate transaction, I didn't get my refund. Proof of delivery can be provided for things like I didn't get my product. And so the idea is by putting that information in front of the issuer before the chargeback is opened, Visa is now holding them accountable when a chargeback is opened despite data that disproves the claim. And so I think as merchants, that's where you guys need to lean into this, because now you as merchants can be involved in the bank process, right? If they call and they're saying something to their bank that's not correct, you can show that. You can push customer service notes. And so the good news here is I think technology as a vehicle for resolving things faster is allowing the merchants to be more actively engaged before the chargeback is raised, which means that it's before the point of pain. Because ultimately, once a chargeback is raised, that's where all the fees and everything comes in. And so I think to shorten that answer back, it would be VAMP and compelling evidence 3.0 from Visa. I think both point very heavily in the direction that Visa is clamping down on fraud, but they're going to do that by holding the acquirers and issuers accountable in a way that they haven't traditionally done.
I think those are really good points. And there are, it's not even just the compelling evidence. There are a bunch of other tools that the merchants can deploy. You talked about consumer clarity that can, help them avoid a lot of this headache and a lot of this heartache, and then also improve their reputation with the issuing bank, right? Because a lot of times this thing that the bank has to go on is sort of past behavior. And once one of your customers or a few of your customers file a dispute, especially if you're not representing those disputes and you're not providing additional information to the issuing bank, then their incentive to provide any type of friction or any safeguards to double check the validity of the chargeback basically goes away. All right, so some questions. Now, just to reiterate here, I've pulled out a couple of questions. We've only got a few minutes left, so we're going to answer a couple of questions here, and then Zach and I are going to continue this conversation. So if you're interested, if you asked a question and want to see if we got to it, we're gonna keep going and answer some questions. However, that's going to be published on the podcast version. So the two questions that I thought were interesting at first glance. Somebody asked, "Is there anything being done with rogue merchants?" So I don't know. I'm not sure what the intention here is. But Zach, how would you address the issue of rogue merchants?
So, I mean, I would read this as like, is anything done when a merchant is completely out of like tolerance? And the answer is yeah. I mean, so Visa's programs were called VDMP and VFMP. The new one's called VAMP. Basically, it's just a bunch of acronyms, but those programs measure chargeback levels, and the merchant is held accountable for a chargeback ratio. If that chargeback ratio goes over a level, they incur massive penalties. They're different under the new program because they're flowed through the acquirer, and that's representative of Visa, again, trying to get the acquirer more skin in the game. But I think under the previous program, I mean, if you were put on VAMP, it could literally cripple your business. And so, yes, I think there are things that are being done with rogue merchants, but I think Visa's changes with VAMP are more about making it less of a impact event and more of it something that people think of overall. So like the old program would punish you very, very harshly when you went over a limit. The new program, I think, is much more focused on managing it proactively and right, like creating a more like steep or like a less steep curve on how all of that flows in, which basically means that like it's less about just staying under and more about eliminating fraud, which is the way that it should be. And so I think, yes, I would say that the schemes are focused on this. I think they always have been. It's just always a dance back and forth with the merchants, the banks, and the schemes in terms of like where things fall. But largely, I would say that rogue merchants from like a chargeback and fraud perspective have to deal with the likes of the programs that the schemes have in place, namely VAMP for Visa.
Yeah. There's definitely consequences. Sometimes the consequences don't take effect as quickly as one might theoretically want. There are some bad behaviors that people are able to get away with for a short period of time. But yeah, generally these schemes and the very rogue behavior is not going to be tolerated and is harder and harder to get away with. And then can chargebacks be completely avoided? I feel like this is always a question when people submit questions, no matter what the topic is. But I felt like it was pretty relevant today, especially because we talked about some of those tools. And Zach, you have frontline knowledge of this, but my understanding, and then you could tell me if I'm wrong, is that we are as close as we've ever been to saying yes, right? We've gotten to the 80, 90 percentile in some rare cases. Prevention. Do you see a world in which 100% prevention is available, assuming that credit card is involved in the transaction and not cryptocurrency?
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say is that it requires true dedication to the process. And I think VAMP is making a lot of merchants have to look at that again because Visa's added a pre-transaction fraud metric in the form of the enumeration ratio. And I think that's endemic of, right, like you can't, if you accept a fraudulent transaction, no, you can't eliminate that. That's going to come through. So the way you eliminate that as a chargeback is by not accepting it. And so I think you have to be comprehensive about preventing fraud up front. That's things like 3DS, AVS, CVV checks, right? All of that stuff, including right velocity checks to make sure that people aren't running a bunch of credit cards through to like try to break through them and commit fraud. And then obviously utilizing things like compelling evidence to do things like separate claims of fraud from actual fraud, fraud instances. And so if you use all of the tools comprehensively, and then also as a merchant, make sure that you avoid things like merchant error, right? Like doing things as a merchant wrong that entitle the customer to their money back, then I mean, yeah, we're pretty close. But it requires, candidly, aggressive tactics that I haven't seen many merchants be able to be committed to, because there's always that like back and forth between, right, 3DS reduces acceptance rates. So, right, like it's friction in your checkout process. So do I want to do that because people bail out? Well, I think if you're committed to eliminating chargebacks completely, it requires acknowledging that that's going to mean not taking some sales, because those are the ones that would have resulted in a chargeback. And so if you're really dedicated to that, yes, I think we're the closest we've ever been. And I think if you get real aggressive with it with things like 3DS, then yes, you can almost get that completely to zero, provided that you can prevent the merchant error ones, because those are the ones that should still be, right? Things like not getting a refund. That's a valid claim. And the way that you avoid that is by making sure that your refund process is ironclad.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I don't, yeah, so 100% is obviously a really, really difficult thing to do. And to Zach's point, I mean, at a certain place, I mean, there's a certain percentage of chargebacks where, the medicine is more detrimental than the disease. To his point with some of the fraud chargebacks, I mean, you could set your fraud threshold such that you decline 30% of your transactions, and you would probably eliminate all of the fraud. But you would also eliminate 30% of your revenue. So, at a certain point, there needs to be a cost calculation that you do as a business owner. But yeah, theoretically, we can get you very, very close. And even just for an average merchant, where the effectiveness of the prevention tools that are available are as strong as they've ever been, if not stronger. We're back, and we're going to go through some additional questions. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the replay of the webinar. The first question is, what type of insurance should I get for coverage? And I assume that they mean chargeback insurance, or, I think as we usually talk about it, indemnification. So Zach, I think you have some pretty strong feelings about indemnification and the role that it's playing.
I mean, I have some strong viewpoints, and that viewpoint is I think the schemes have some feelings about it. So to explain, or right, like, indemnification is essentially a service that's provided by a handful of companies. There's some, right, if you Google it, you're going to find some big ones. And what it basically is it provides a service where if your frontline fraud filter says, don't take this, it's probably fraud, you can send it to them for a second opinion. And if they approve it, they'll say, well, actually, if you take this, we'll indemnify it, meaning if you get a chargeback, we'll pay for it. But here's the problem. Before, in days gone by, your fraud metrics didn't include TC40s. They only included TC15s. Well, what is a TC40? That's the fraud flag. The TC15 is the chargeback. A way of saying that is if you gave a refund, it was okay. It didn't count anymore. And so these companies that provided indemnification would basically pay you and then work with you to make sure that you didn't get the right, like that you either had room in your ratio or that you refunded it. And so the idea here is Visa's been pretty clear. It's not okay to accept a fraudulent transaction and just provide a refund. So now that TC40 that's filed and never goes away for any fraud flag that you get is counted in your ratio. And if you look at it, like, the numbers look like they've gone up, but they haven't. And mathematically, right, I think a lot of people that are working with indemnification providers that I'm familiar with, the conversations I'm having are about the fact that their current strategy will be costing them lots of money under the new guidelines, because accepting fraud is a much more punished event. And so I think I would maybe hold off and see what happens with that, because I think that's an entire industry niche, indemnification, that the VAMP changes are going to make really, really, really uncertain for the next little bit. And so that's my 2 cents on it. I think VAMP is what is informing that. And I think in general, right, if you want to get down to it, I'm not a big fan of indemnification, but I think right now I would take a very bigger second look at it, because I think it's kind of, as a concept, under attack by Visa.
Yeah, I think I understand why ideas like chargeback insurance are appealing to merchants, right? The consistency, the expectation. But the few times that I've taken a look at it, the end cost is greater. It's just distributed evenly over, it's sort of hidden better. But when you talk about the lingering consequence of the fraud, right? Just getting that covered doesn't really solve the problem.
Well, what they're indemnifying is the cost of the chargeback, the refund. They're
Right.
not indemnifying the fees.
Yeah.
They're not indemnifying the fact that if they blow your ratio.
Yeah.
And so, right, like it's not the cost of a chargeback, especially a fraud chargeback, is not just the cost, is not just the value of the transaction. It's bigger than that. And I think VAMP in particular is Visa saying, and fraud chargebacks are worse than non-fraud chargebacks. So, right, any ecosystem which, right, indemnification is exclusively fraud. It's a fraud filter said this is gonna hit fraud. It's a stolen card, and you take it anyway. And so, right, like the idea is Visa's saying, well, the right thing to do is to not take it, right? If you think it's gonna, because, right, like Visa's creating a world where if it's fraud, they get their money back. So don't take it, because by the way, they get their money back and you get fees, and creating ways to separate from claims of fraud and actual fraud. And so as merchants, I think it's a pretty strong statement that any behaviors where you're accepting fraud and hoping that it sticks, Visa's going to continue turning up the heat on that. That's my opinion.
That's really interesting that you said that fraud is worse than non-fraud. For I think a long time when people talked about chargebacks, fraud was sort of like the unavoidable, like victim, like it was just sort of the thing that everybody worried about was the non-fraud chargebacks. And now that there's, some pressure on the other side, I think that's super interesting. Okay, so rather than go down here and get all the way into the VAMP weeds, I think I'd like to have you back and we'll do another special on VAMP, because I think even since the webinar that you did last month, I think that there's been some changes, and so people have even more questions than they had last month. So maybe we'll do a monthly VAMP webinar until all the updates have stopped changing things. So the next one is arbitration guidelines and fees. And, each of these can be their own webinar, but is there something that you can comment on briefly about arbitration guidelines and fees? Is there some kind of pearl of wisdom that we could squeeze out of you that people would find value?
I mean, the fees are prohibitively expensive intentionally, and I think they've continued to go up. So, right, like Visa is not taking them down, they are increasing them. And so I think what you see is Visa's trying to hold the issuers and the acquirers more accountable for not letting in invalid chargebacks. And I think there are a lot of pre-arbitration requirements where, like, if you, as an example, under scheme regulations, if you file a pre-arbitration request, or like, right, like if you win, the cardholder isn't supposed to be able to contest that without providing new evidence. We see often that that's not the case. And I think you're going to start to see a little bit more of an accountability loop on second cycles as well. But I think what I would say is the fees are very high. The regulations are not super clear. And so it makes that a very delicate thing to fight pre-arbitrations and right second cycles. And so what I would say is if you don't think you have the right information, I'd be very careful, because even by way of a pure what's your win rate and what's the ticket value, unless, right, if you've got a 50% win rate, your ticket value needs to be about $2,000 to make it worth fighting a pre-arbitration just based on fees and likely outcomes. And so, right, like in many cases, it's one of those where it's like it's a case of pick your battles.
Well, and it gets confusing too. And this is arbitration, not even pre-arbitration, but it gets confusing too because, with some chargebacks, Visa got rid of one of the steps, right? So like, isn't the first dispute kind of technically a pre-arbitration? And it just gets super complicated. But
that's for fraud specifically.
You've advanced to the second round, right? Like you get the golden buzzer and you make it to the second round. Just probably write it off unless it's a really, really high ticket item, because it's not the risk and consequence.
The expedited regulations or guidelines are for fraud. And so I think that the pearl of wisdom here that I would say is that if you are going to fight pre-arbitrations, and right, like this is also very much in line with how we do it for our customers, the ones that you should be looking through are the service related reason codes, where you have really, really strong evidence to disprove the customer's claim. And so things like I didn't get my product, I didn't get my refund, those types of things are the places where, right, if you have really robust, rich evidence and you can disprove the claim, that's going to be a lot easier, because fraud tends to be one of those where if the cardholder just keeps saying it's fraud, I don't know what you're talking about, Right,
Yeah.
aside from compelling evidence that we've already talked about, there isn't much you can do. And so if a claim of fraud gets to that stage, I would be very careful with pushing it forward. Right. And I think pre-arbitrations and second cycles and arbitrations, I think are in my experience, we see a lot more success on the services side of things, because fraud, again, tends to be very much judge, jury, and executioner, and not in the merchant's favor.
Okay, the next one is how are chargeback reason codes evolving in 2025? Are there any new codes being introduced to reflect changes in payment behavior or fraud trends?
There's not really anything notable there. They've made some
Mhm.
minor changes with like rolling up and grouping and ungrouping some stuff, but like I don't think that it makes sense to get down into that level of minutia.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that we are going to start to see some new stuff tracked and some new metrics. But I don't know that that's going to be merchant facing. I think, right, we're going to start to see like what happens with an accusation of fraud that's stopped by CE 3.0. I think you might start to see some like issuer side metrics on stuff like that. And I think that that would be a different reason code. And I think that the comment that I would make about reason code is I think Visa and MasterCard in the past had been focused on changing and making more. I think the focus now is on accuracy.
Yeah. In fact, so this is interesting because, specifically with reason codes, it took so long. It takes so long for the reason codes when they do make the changes to actually like trickle down and all of the systems be updated. We had a significant number of clients. I don't know when MasterCard officially updated. I think they announced that they were going to kind of do the thing where they rolled up some of the reason codes into like groups. They made that change, but we still had merchants, and we were still responding to the old MasterCard, reason codes for more than a year afterwards, because the issuing bank or acquiring bank or whatever the system was between the merchant and the card schemes hadn't been updated to reflect that change. And I think MasterCard finally said, you have to make the change. We're not going to, process data, using this old code anymore. Also changes. I was really surprised the first time I saw, one of the emails that go out with all the scheme changes, number of changes that happen all the time. Changes this way, changes that way, reversing a change that they announced last month. I mean, the keeping on top of it is really challenging, and that oftentimes is the thing that runs into that merchants have issues with, is that there's a change and they haven't been made aware of it, and they're not taking advantage of it. So anyway, that's next one is, do signatures from deliveries hold any weight in a chargeback?
Yes, they do. But I think the way that again is being enforced. So right, like one of the prevailing things from VAMP that we've talked about, and I'm not going to soapbox on it again, is that issuers are being held accountable, right, for right reason codes, for citing the right way, for those types of things. And so I think if you know the scheme regulations and you know how to navigate that stuff, right, having that evidence is, yes, absolutely positive or positively powerful, because that is compelling evidence. But I think we're still not to a place where having it means 100% win rate. Right. I think there's still the issuer is making that decision. I do think that a signature proof of delivery, though, we live in a world where real-time data alerts would allow you to, I didn't get my product. Well, you signed for it. Right. And I think that then shifts that liability to the issuer to have that conversation before the chargeback is raised. And so I think what I would say is that's fantastic evidence. Absolutely use it. But I would be working with a provider like Chargebacks 911 even, to make sure that that evidence is available in that real-time data exchange process up front, so that when that starts to be the prevailing paradigm, that you can immediately take advantage of it. Because I think it will absolutely help your win rate, but it still requires, you may have to tap someone on the shoulder and be like, wait, they signed it. What do you mean they didn't get it, right? And you may still have to point that out, versus the nice thing about compelling evidence is it's literally a bunch of data checks. Provide the data, get the outcome. And I think that is a data point that logically as humans, right, should be, if you provide it, you win. And so I think, yes, fantastic evidence, but make sure that you're applying it the correct way, because ultimately, in many cases, using the evidence the right way is as important as having it.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. So I think what this person is asking about is compelling evidence. And we talked about it a little bit, but the way that this person phrased the question is, what is the best backup to submit for disputes and chargebacks? So my assumption is that they mean like, what is the best piece of compelling evidence that you can use? And I think that this is kind of, if I'm interpreting this question right, this is one of the most common fallacies that we see. Merchants have the idea that, okay, I'm going to put together a case. I'm going to always include these 5 data points, and I'm going to send these cases off, and I'm going to be successful. Zach, why don't you tell us why that's wrong?
I mean, the representment process is human led. So, right, like you have humans that are reviewing this stuff. So like order placement, all of that stuff becomes important. And there's no one rule, or there's no like one answer to rule them all in this situation. Unfortunately, it's an
Yeah.
art. I mean, there's a massive amount of code in our system that goes into analyzing and rearranging and picking the data points and that's based on, right, like having represented millions of chargebacks. So it's not an answer that can be distilled down to that level. Right. But to give you some like pointers, reason code, stuff like that tend to go back to, right. The schemes have guidance on what you're supposed to do in these situations. Unfortunately, it's contained in tens of thousands of pages of updates and stuff that is not easy for a human to read, keep up on, or summarize.
Yeah.
And so there isn't a silver bullet. I think to that point, being integrated for as many services as possible, having robust data and studying the compelling evidence guidelines from Visa are a really, really great way to make sure that you've got your bases as covered as you can.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And, just to drill down into that, I think that, um, obviously the reason code requires different compelling evidence, right? You wouldn't provide the same type of case for completely different reason codes. So paying attention to that and having a different strategy for every reason code is sort of like level 1 strategy, right? Like that basic level of organization. Where, where it gets a little bit advanced is then also paying attention to the issuing bank or even the acquiring bank in some cases, to know what their preference is, because even if it makes sense that these 3 pieces of data is what the card schemes say is going to be effective, if you know that the issuing bank is a bank that really likes to see 5 pieces of data, and they really like the whatever IP address in every single case, even if it isn't a piece of compelling evidence, they're gonna be more likely to overturn the case. But the opposite is just as true. So the opposite is just as true, where if what you do is overload your cases with a bunch of evidence to make sure that you've given the evidence over, to Zach's point, that at some point that case is going to interface with a human who's very busy, who's looking at cases all day long, and is just trying to make the best decision that they can. And if you've thrown everything against the wall, the likelihood that that person is going to be able to sort through that in the seconds or minute that they have goes down exponentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess that's it. We have some more questions here. How to win a dispute, I feel like, is probably a little bit longer than we're going to be able to go into. But again, anybody that asked a question during the webinar or before the webinar, we'll make sure to answer, at least direct you to some resources that we've put together, so that your question doesn't get shouted into the wind. We'll definitely hear you over here at Chargebacks 911. And thank you again, Zach. I know this was a long one because we had the webinar, and then we had this conversation, and I kept throwing
My pleasure,
questions
man.
at
Thanks
you.
for having me on.
I appreciate you making the time today. I know that you're busy, and I do love your knickknack collection, man.
I appreciate it. Like I said, it's representative of a lot of fond memories. So
Yeah. All right. Well,
cheers.
if you like this, like and subscribe, or don't. I'll be cool either way. Bye, guys.